After the events of the Hatch-Russia War and the Dalkalian Dance, von Fersen had in July 1743 obtained leave to return to French service. When he later that year arrived in France, he was employed as an adjutant in the service of the Comte de Noailles. In the spring of 1744, von Fersen was promoted to colonel at the Royal Alsace Regiment, fought in the Flanders campaign in Alsace and was at the small Battle of Hochfeld. In September he was named Aide Major General, participated in the Bayern campaign, and in December he was permitted for the first time to raise his own regiment in the service of the Holy Roman Emperor. But when the regiment was ready in March of 1745, Emperor Charles VII had died, and the peace between Bavaria and Austria was signed a month later. Instead, von Fersen was allowed to transfer his regiment to the French army. He participated in Maurice de Sac's campaign in Flanders in 1747, where he distinguished himself by driving off enemy forces from the area around Charleroi. The next year he was given command of the Alsace Brigade and participated in the siege of Maastricht. When peace was signed in May of that year, he got promotion to brigadier in the French army, which corresponded to Major General in Sweden at the time. Shortly before Christmas that year, von Fersen got the message that his mother had died, and he therefore travelled home. The political landscape in Sweden that von Fersen came home to was complicated. In 1744, the new crown prince, Adolf Fredrik, had married Lovisa Ulrika, a sister of Prussia's Frederick the Great. Lovisa Ulrika was a strong political force of her own, and was soon the leading voice in the marriage. She favored a stronger monarchy, and soon a group of nobles gathered around her leadership in what would eventually develop into the Royal Court Party. A smaller party than the big two parties, but still a party that would have an impact on Swedish politics. Also, the Swedish parliamentary system, which gave extensive powers to the parliament and individual parliamentarians, had one big flaw. It led to large-scale corruption when parliamentarians could sell their votes and influence, a fact that Sweden's neighbors gladly took advantage of. The Hats had long taken money from France, whom they were very close to, while the Caps received significant money from Russia and Britain. The Royal Court Party was mostly a split from the Hat Party, and Lovisa Ulrika used bribes to both the Hats and the Caps to affect policy in the direction she wanted it. She had been asked by her brother to get an alliance between Sweden and Prussia, which she accomplished in 1747. When von Fersen came home, he quickly got embroiled in the ongoing split between the Hats and the court. At the time there were 3 open Major General positions in the Swedish army, and Fersen applied for one of these. The old King Frederick was sympathetic to Fersen, but by now he was old and frail, and much influence was exercised by the Crown Prince, who opposed giving him the rank. The court party faction argued it was too big a step for Fersen to take. He was still only a corporal in the Drabant Corps, which was roughly equivalent to a major in the regular army. They argued it therefore upset regular order too much. The situation got solved by the Hats forcing the promotion through, but it was evident that the issue of royal power was a major split between the factions. In 1752, von Fersen married Hedvig Katarina de la Gardie from one of the wealthiest and most influential families in Sweden. His marriage and the inheritance from his mother meant that he was now among the largest landowners in the country. Von Fersen participated in the Parliament of 1751-52, where he got his real introduction to politics. 4 years later, his political influence had risen so much that he was now the Hats' candidate in the election for Lord Marshal, the most important position in Parliament. Von Fersen stood against Erik Brahe, who belonged to the court's faction, and won with 591 votes against 414. In June 1756, a lieutenant and Hat Party member named Lawrence Kreutz told von Fersen of rumors he had heard about a coup being organized by the king and queen. Von Fersen sent word to his friend Augustin Ehrensvärd in Sveaborg to keep the fortress under lockdown, and then organized sympathetic nobles in a militia defense of Parliament. Months earlier, Parliament had gotten suspicious about rumors that the crown jewels were missing. The suspicions had grown stronger when the queen had been reluctant to produce them when asked. It was now revealed that she had pawned them in Berlin to finance the coup. But the plan had failed when a courtier got drunk and prematurely talked about the plot. When arrested, the courtier revealed the whole thing and the coup was stopped. The king and queen wanted to use the royal guard to get out of Stockholm and get support to continue the coup. But von Fersen had earlier in the year been named commander of the guard, and the guard now refused to act. The conspirators were soon arrested and several were later executed. Among them was Erik Brahe, who von Fersen had just beaten in the election for Lord Marshal. The king and queen were spared though, but there was a plan for their removal set that would be enforced if they tried anything like that again. Von Fersen went to the king and explained that from now on his signature would be stamped on documents, removing the need for his participation entirely. But the relationship between the king and von Fersen would recover, and over the next 15 years the relationship would grow to be very warm. They got so close that when the king one night in February 1771 indulged a little bit too heavy on his desserts and had a stroke, he fell into the arms of his by then newly named Field Marshal von Fersen, and later that evening died. Queen Louisa Ulrika was less conciliatory in the years after the coup attempt and would never stop dreaming of overthrowing the ruling order. In a letter to her brother, she complained of how she was treated and wrote, "In my hardest moments, I remind myself that I am the sister of Frederick the Great." A couple of months after the attempted coup, war broke out in Europe when Prussia invaded Saxony. France, who was close to the ruling Hat Party, pressured Sweden to declare war on Prussia. They argued the invasion of Saxony was a violation of the Peace of Westphalia from 1648, of which both France and Sweden were guarantors, which would mean both countries had a legitimate excuse for war. But over the more than 100 years since the Peace of Westphalia, the power dynamics between Sweden and Brandenburg Prussia had changed dramatically. Sweden no longer had the ability to defeat Prussia, and the Hats knew it. Though this time Prussia was engaged by multiple strong powers and could only focus limited forces on a campaign in Pomerania. France also promised monetary support for the Swedish efforts, and Russia promised it would assist with troops. The upside would be that a favorable peace might win back the parts of Pomerania that Sweden lost in the Great Northern War 40 years earlier, and a win over her native country would also have the added bonus of humiliating Queen Louisa Ulrika. For those reasons, the Hats government chose to declare war on Prussia. But despite multiple attempts to invade Prussia over the next 5 years, the war would be a failure. The Hats had again overestimated the strength of the Swedish army, which were in desperate need of training and rearmament. The war started in September 1757, with Swedish forces crossing the border into Prussia and quickly capturing Peenemünde, Swinemünde and Anklam. But 2 months later, news came that the Prussian army had defeated a combined French-Austrian army at the Battle of Rorschach. Instead of marching further into Prussia, the Swedish commander now figured the situation was too dangerous and instead chose to withdraw to Stralsund, where they were soon followed by a Prussian army, and a stalemate ensued. No more Swedish offensive attempts would be made until the summer of the next year. Command now changed hand 2 times, and by summer 1758, Gustav David Hamilton was now the new commander of Swedish forces. In July, Augustin Ehrensvärd recaptured Peenemünde fort, and Hamilton took the main Swedish army into Prussia to link up with the Russians at Kystrin. But the Russians were defeated by the Prussians at the Battle of Zorndorf, and Hamilton instead decided to try to link up with the Austrians in Saxony. In September, Prussia sent a force of about 6,000 men to check the Swedish advance. From that force, a detachment of up to 2,000 cavalry attacked about 800 Swedes who held the small town of Tornov. Prussian cavalry charged the Swedish infantry 6 times without result, but the Swedish cavalry was too small and too weak to counterattack, and the Swedes was eventually forced to retreat. 2 days later, the entire Prussian force attacked the town of Fehmarn. The town was held by another Swedish force of about 800 men, this time under Major Carl Constantin de Carnal. The Swedes managed to hold the town against assaults, and when Swedish reinforcements arrived, the Prussians retreated. In October, the Austrians surprised the Prussians at the Battle of Hochkirch, but it would prove a temporary success, and soon it was clear that the Austrians had failed in their overall campaign, and Hamilton was now forced to turn back. The campaign of 1758 had been a failure, and when it also became clear that the Russians had gone into winter quarters, Hamilton decided to return all the way to Stralsund. The next year, Axel von Fersen himself participated in operations. He worked out a plan to capture the Prussian islands of Usedom and Wollin, for which he was given 4,000 men, while the rest of the army was to lay siege to Stettin. The capture of these territories would then enable the Swedish army to link up with the Russians besieging Kolberg. To give von Fersen's plan a higher success probability, the Swedish navy first needed to destroy the Prussian navy that was under build-up. At the Battle of Frieseshaff, the Finnish squadron of the Archipelago fleet crushed the small Prussian fleet, ending any serious Prussian naval operations for the rest of the Pomeranian War. Von Fersen then successfully executed his plan to occupy the islands. But the attempt to besiege Stettin by the main army was a failure, and at the end of 1759 the Swedish army went back to Swedish Pomerania for winter quarters. 1760 started with a Prussian attempt to invade Swedish Pomerania, which was stopped. The Swedish army under General Adam Horn then counterattacked and won a battle at the town of Anklam, where the Prussian general in charge, Heinrich von Manteuffel, was captured. An interesting side note is that one of the Swedish hussars that were wounded in the battle later switched side and had a rather famous career in the Prussian army, reaching the rank of field marshal during the Napoleonic Wars. His name? Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. The rest of 1760 did not contain any serious Swedish offensives into Prussia. By this time the Swedish army lacked officers, since many of them had returned home to participate in the Parliament of 1760 to 1762. In August the Swedish High Seas Fleet, with 6 ships of the line and 3 frigates, joined the Russian bombardment of Kolberg, which ended in a failure a month later. In October a Prussian force of about 4,000 tried to attack a Swedish force of about 1,700 under Augustin Ehrensvärd holding the town of Pasewalk. Ehrensvärd himself was injured in the fighting, but the Prussians were defeated and had to retreat. A year later, in September of 1761, a force under Jakob Magnus Sprängputen defeated a larger Prussian force at the Battle of Neuensund. The battle had no real significant impact on the war, but Sprängputen will become important later in our story when he helps return the monarchy to power. A couple of months later, in January of 1762, the last battle of the war is fought, when a Swedish force under Carl Constantin der Kanal defeated a smaller Prussian force at Neukalden. Overall, the war had been a failure. Repeated Swedish attempts to invade Prussia had been beaten back, and when Russia under its new Tsar Peter III switched side, the Hats realized it was time to call for peace. Instead of humiliating the Queen, the opposite had now happened, and the Hats' party's grip on power got severely strained. The Queen had, through clever positioning and bribes, managed to get herself appointed as the Swedish peace negotiator with her brother, the Prussian king. The war ended with the status quo upheld, and the Queen was personally credited by Parliament for preserving all of Swedish Pomerania. Von Fersen had tried to steer the Hats closer to the court's party again, to be able to preserve their grip on power. Despite this, it was clear the Hats' time at the helm was soon coming to its end. The Hats managed to stay in power over the long, hard-fought Parliament of 1760 to 1762. But 4 years later, the opposing Caps party won the election 532 votes to 415 against von Fersen and the Hats,